Ever feel someone's there when you're not alone? Tonight, your companion's not what it seems. And the companion. The ugliness of her rented cottage was a constant source of perverse satisfaction to Miss Clayard. To have traveled in the course of her 70-odd years over the most civilized world, to have lived in several of the most elegant capitals, and finally to have come to roost in number 3, Vasco's cottage, had an incongruity that pleased her tart, ironic spirit. Miss Clayard indulged in a constant battle against life's unreasonableness and inequities. Her private bubbly hobby was finding fault with the British government, world so-called leaders, with her bank, with her friends, with the young, the old, the stupid, the BBC third program, the weather, and the cakes from the village shop. It gave her intense, not wholly masochistic gratification to survey her hideous rented furniture, to go into her dark little unfunctional kitchen, and discover the gas pilot had gone out again, that before putting a kettle on to boil she must laboriously poke a long-stemmed match into the dirty intestines of the stove, at the same time a small gritty and inconveniently placed wheel, and wait for a resulting muffled explosion. This ritual, which often had to be enacted several times a day due to the fluctuations of gas pressure, filled her with a dour amusement, confirming, as it did, with almost pessimistic feelings about the world. The aged, recalcitrant plastic ice trays, which were more likely to split in half under the pressure of an angry thumb than to eject a single cube of ice, the front gate that refused to latch properly, the wayward taps turning in improbable directions, emitting a thin thread of lukewarm water, the varying levels of the cottage, which had steps up or steps down between all the rooms, and even one in the middle of the bathroom. These things fulfilled her expectation that life was intended to be a series of cynical booby traps. Nevertheless, Miss Clydesdale would have lived in comfort if she had chosen. She was rich, had been married, had a successful career as a painter, had had children, even now satisfactorily grown and disposed of. She was a handsome, intelligent, and cultivated woman. Death had removed her husband, it was true, but otherwise she need have had little to complain about. Yet all possible amenities had been, it seemed, wantonly jettisoned in favor of retreat into the exile of a Cornish village. Not even a romantic exile, for Tallinn was far from picturesque. It was a small, random conglomerate of ill-assorted, mostly granite buildings, established on a treeless hillside as if they had been dropped there. Vasco's cottages, of which Miss Cleriard occupied number 3, had been a 19th century addition. Two pairs of plain red brick, semi-detached labourers' dwellings, which some hopeful later landlord had embellished with heavy chalet-type ornamental woodwork, thereby further darkening the already inadequately lit interiors. "Oh, that will do for me very nicely," Miss Cleriard had remarked with her usual brief smile on first observing number 3 over its stout enclosing privet hedge. "Are you certain?" her friend and prospective landlady, Miss Helena Soames, doubtfully inquired. "Are you sure it'll be big enough for you? Light enough? The furniture's rather a job lot, I'm afraid. I could have it taken out if you'd like to put it in your own things." "No, no, let them stay in store. I can't be bothered with them. This is admirable, and the furniture will last my time." Miss Cleriard is in excellent health, but she always spoke and acted as if in expectation of imminent death. She moved herself into the cottage with minimum of fuss, and added Pincha, a typewriter, some books, quickly learned the names and ways of the local tradespeople, and had soon established herself on terms of remarkable cordiality with all her neighbors. The terms being that when she listened to, indeed, drew out by some unique osmosis of her own, all their dissatisfactions and complaints, meanwhile herself maintained a considerable reticence. Complaint is addictive. People came back eagerly again and again for more. Clyburn had all the company she could have wished for. She listened, she made her own dry comments, and never dispersed advice. This was the secret of her popularity. She never offered information about herself or divulged her own feelings. If asked what she did with herself all day, for it was plain she was neither house proud nor a dedicated gardener, she replied, "I am writing my memoirs. I've known any number of famous people." And it was true, she had. plenty of reputations will have the rug pulled from under them if I don't die before I have finished. Although she frequently and dryly referred to her possible death, she manifested no anxiety about the prospect and seemed not particularly troubled as to whether she finished her memoirs first or not. Very few things appeared to trouble Miss Clairard particularly. She found a sour pleasure in her occupations. Meanwhile, the years rolled by, bestowing on her no signs of age or infirmity, nor did she manifest any disposition to seek more comfortable quarters than number 3, Vasco's. "I don't know how you endure this poky little place," Miss Morgan frequently remarked when she dropped in to complain about Miss Soames. "It's so dark and cold. When I was living here with the old lady, I thought I should go mad with the inconvenience. It must be the most awkward house in the world, even with that lift installed." The old lady had been Helen Soames's mother, Miss Musgrave. For 10 years prior to her death from heart disease, she had occupied number 3, Vasco's, and Miss Morgan had been her companion. The lift had been installed for Miss Musgrave's benefit. It consisted of a metal chair with a counterbalance in the stairwell operated by a small electric motor. Miss Musgrave's son, an engineer, had installed it himself. The old lady had sat in the chair herself in the chair and buckled in with seat belt. Then she pressed a button and was conveyed slowly up or slowly down. The lift, with its ugly metalwork, still remained, but Miss Clyard, who had a rude mistrust of all machinery, saw no occasion to make use of it. After 10 years, Miss Musgrave had died, and Miss Morgan, lacking a function, was removed to the manor to housekeep for the daughter, Miss Soames, an arrangement which gave little satisfaction to either party. Almost every day at tea time, Miss Morgan called in on Miss Clyard with some grievance to relate about Miss Soames's fault finding, heartlessness, inconsistency, or sarcasm, to which Miss Clyard listened with her usual acute impassivity. "I do wish you would have for me your companion, dear Miss Clyard," Miss Morgan, who had a slight stammer, often sighed out. "I'm sure we could get on so well. I'd be happy to look after everything for you while you wrote your memoirs, and would not dream of asking for a salary. All I want is a home. My dear woman, what possible use would I have for a companion in this tiny box of a house? I am almost too much company for myself." Wispy, myopic little Miss Morgan would take herself off, pleading, "Think it over, Miss dear Clyard. Do think it over." In the evenings, Miss Clyard often heard the other side of the case. Her friend Helena generally dropped in for a glass of sherry and a grumble about Miss Morgan's self-pity, insufficient inefficiency, forgetfulness, untidiness, tendency to martyrdom, and general inadequacy. Miss Clyard made no comment on that either, nor did she see fit to intervene when Miss Solmes's patient finally ran out. She dismissed an unsatisfactory housekeeper, who, being far too old by now to secure another post, went lamenting away to live with her married sister in land livery, after a final and unavailing plea to Miss Clyard to take her in. More time went by. Miss Clyde lent a non-committal card to the outpourings of other neighbors, of harassed parents who could not deal with their young, of rebellious teenagers who could not endure their parents, of betrayed husbands, of frustrated wives, and of disillusioned friends who had fallen out. Her own private life remained as apparently tranquil as ever. Her excellently coiffed iron gray hair turned a shade paler, her hawk-like profile was unchanged. She wrote a few pages a day at the desk in her upstairs study, cooked light meals for herself, waged her usual guerrilla war against the inconveniences of her house, and continued in her customary state of sardonic composure. But presently, and how it happened Miss Clyburn was not presently aware, for the change came in such gradual degrees, her equable daily routine became disrupted, not seriously, but just enough to be noticeable. The form taken by the disturbance was this: Miss Clyrod, seated upstairs in a state of recollected tranquillity at her typewriter, would suddenly find her concentration broken by an odd urge to go below and perform some slight unnecessary task in the kitchen. Sometimes her more rational self was able to withstand the trivial impulse, but sometimes it was not, and almost before she was aware of the process, she would find herself at the kitchen sink, washing tea cloths, or cleaning the leaded glass panes in the front door, which made no difference to the light, for the untrimmed privet hedge grew within 6 feet of it, or polishing shoes, or defrosting the refrigerator. This was very annoying, but Miss Clairrod had no intention of submitting to it. She was a woman of total practicality. If she felt a twinge in the tooth, she consulted her dentist. If she detected a rattle in her car, she referred it to the garage. Possible psychic phenomena weighted no more and no less in her estimation than failures in the electrical system or mice in the pantry, as she would call an electrician or a cat for the latter inconveniences. For the former, she had recourse to an exorcist. Fortunately, she was acquainted with one, an old friend of hers, a rural dean living in semi-retirement in Bath, who still took an active interest in paranormal occurrences and occasionally officiated in a ceremony to remove some unwelcome or disturbed spirit. Miss Clyrod wrote and invited him for a visit, arranging to have him accommodated at a nearby guest house, since she detested having people staying in the cottage. When he arrived, she lost no time explaining the nuisance to him. Somebody's trying to occupy my mind, or my house, she said matter of factly, though with a considerable degree of irritation. I should be very much obliged if you could deal with it for me, Roger. The dean, delighted with the odd problem, promised to see what he could do. To assist him, he fetched over a medium from Bath, the city most plagued by psychic phenomena, possibly due to its enclosed, low-lying, and damp situation. The medium, Miss Hannah Huxley, a portly blind lady, acquiesced with the dean in taking the problem as a most serious challenge. They turned back the carpets. They inscribed formulae and diagrams repellent to invading spirits on the floor of all the rooms. They recited incantations. They lit candles and sprinkled water. They performed various rituals involving the doors, the windows, the curtains, the mirrors, the stairs, the fireplace, and the lights. At one point during the proceedings, which were long, and to Miss Clyrod somewhat tedious and repetitious, Miss Huxley went into a trance. "Did your husband," she suddenly inquired, emerging from this condition as abruptly as she had gone into it, "did your husband die of a head injury, Miss Clyrod?" "Certainly not," said Miss Clyrod with asperity, startled and not best pleased at the intrusion with her private affairs. "He died of intestinal carcinoma." "That's odd. I have distinct evidence of a presence quite close to you who has sometimes suffered from a head injury. Are you quite sure that you can think of no such person?" Miss Clyrod moved a step or two aside distastefully before replying again, "Absolutely not." Her faith by now somewhat diminished, she watched in ironic silence as the dean and Miss Huxley came to the conclusion of their ritual, having now apparently located the intrusive entity. Kindly, cajoling, uttering mellifluous Latin phrases formed for the purpose of coaxing such undesired visitants from their lodgings, the dean walked slowly backward, beckoning to the front door, opened it, waited, and recited a final prohibiting admonition before closing the door and returning to the fireside. "There, it's gone," he said with a beaming smile. "It can't come back inside now." "It?" thought Miss Clyrard, on an impulse of strong protest. How can that vague, unhappy, intrusive, undefinable animation be compressed into and pined down by a prurresque, particular little monosyllable as "it"? Poor thing, it simply hated to leave, the dean went on. "No, I'm afraid he didn't want to go in the very least. Did you hear it whimpering?" Miss Clyrard had not. Stifling her skepticism, however, she civilly thanked the dean and his colleague, refreshed them after their exertions with tea and cakes from the village shop, conversed for a polite hour, and finally, with relief, saw them to the door and said good-bye. Still skeptical, but in a cool spirit of scientific investigation, she went upstairs for experimental hours writing, and the dean had been completely right. Perfectly justified in his confidence, there was nothing to disturb her concentration. She found she could work in an untroubled peace for a whole hour. Not a single thought of tea things waiting unwashed downstairs so much as slipped over the edge of her consciousness. When Helena Soames presently arrived for a glass of sherry at 6:30, Miss Clyrod was in a highly self-congratulatory state of mind, and contrary to her usual recipient habit, related the story. "But I still can't imagine who that person suffering from a head injury can be," she concluded. "Oh, can't you?" said Miss Soames, who had listened with the greatest interest. "But it's perfectly obvious, my dear. It must be poor Miss Morgan." "Miss Morgan? Did she have a head injury? I never knew of it." "It was over before you came to the village, of course. In fact, it happened when Miss Morgan was looking after my mother in this cottage, after Edward had installed the chairlift. Miss Morgan had strapped mother in, and then, stupid woman, struck her head over the banister to say, 'Is there anything you want me to bring you, Miss Musgrave?' Of course, the counterbalance came down, hit her on the head, and knocked her silly. She was never quite the same after that, but then she hadn't been too bright to start with. Luckily, mother died not long afterwards." "Miss Morgan, yes, of course," said Miss Clyrard reflectively, remembering the doleful little woman's plea to be allowed to return to the inconveniences of number 3, Vasco's. I'd be so happy to look after the house for you while you wrote your memoirs. I wouldn't dream of asking for a salary. All I want is a home. It simply hated to leave, Roger had said. It didn't want to go in the very least. Looked at those through those eyes, the dark and poky sitting room with its totting courtroom furnishings momentarily took on the appearance of warm and happy haven. Miss Morgan, Miss Clarard said again, what became of her? Oh, she went to live with her married sister in land livery. The sister had always despised her. Miss Morgan didn't want to go, but what could she do? At her age, she couldn't get another job. Anyway, evidently it was a disastrous arrangement, for about 6 months later I heard she drowned herself in a brook. All for the best, really, as I said. She'd never been quite with it after that accident. Well, you must have noticed it. You used to come wailing around to you often enough. Yes, so she did, Miss Clara had said in the same thoughtful manner. Miss Morgan, that melancholy, ineffectual little woman, ineffectual in death as in life, apparently. Or was she? Seeing Helena to the door half an hour later, closing it briskly behind her, Miss Clyrard was aware for the first time that the previous trivial, thought, irri- irritating mental distractions which had assailed her might have been exchanged for something even more unaccustomed. A sensation of discomposure, disquiet, perhaps even to analyze it closely, fear. For although the dean and Miss Huxley had led the whimpering, reluctant whatever it was along to the front door and out of the house, that was all they had done. They had not claimed to have annihilated it or driven it any further than the threshold. Miss Clyrard allowed herself an uneasy glance at the door, which framed its glass pane square of dark. Might not her visitor, out there in her little privet enclosed garden, out there behind the glass paned door in the rainy night, might it not feel now, perhaps a certain degree of resentment at its exclusion? Miss Clyrod heard the garden gate, which as usual had failed to latch properly, begin to creak and clatter as it swung to and fro in the rising wind. She knew she ought to go and unfasten the gate before the hinges were damaged, and yet she lingered in the dreary little hallway, strangely reluctant to set foot outside the security of her house. Well, that companion wasn't so friendly, was it? Some guests never leave, ghouls. Sleep alone tonight?